Alright guys, today I am going to show you how to care for and maintain a sourdough starter. This is my sourdough starter here. I have him in a different container for right now because I'm going to wash his current habitat. A sourdough starter is a way to leaven bread or other bread products without the use of commercial instant yeast. This guy here, he has natural yeast from our environment in him, which gives the leavening power that is needed to make all sorts of beautiful bread products. The reason to use sourdough starter is that it has some good health benefits. The slow fermentation process that happens when you use sourdough starter to leaven your bread causes the grains in your bread to break down to be more easily digested, as well as it is a good source of probiotics and prebiotics, which anybody who's interested in the sciencey stuff will know that that's really necessary for a good healthy gut. I will take you with me today as I clean, well, I'll clean this, you don't have to watch that, but as I feed this guy, and I'll walk you through the stages of what it looks like as it rises and when it's ready to use for whatever bread stuffs you have in mind. All right, guys, I'm back with a clean habitat here. We are going to feed this guy. Oh, I never gave you a proper introduction. This guy's name is Bruce. He needs fed a lot. The reason he's called Bruce is like Bruce Wayne, aka Batman, because he rises in the night. The ultimate dad joke. You've got to have enough dad jokes in your life. It makes life more interesting. But I've got a clean habitat here, so I'm going to pour Bruce back in. You might be wondering why I have such a large container for Bruce. This is completely preference. The size container you use for your sourdough starter, it can be whatever you want it to be. It only needs to be large enough to handle the sourdough starter doubling in size after it's fed. Sometimes sourdough starters will actually a little bit more than double, depending how strong they are or what the temperature of your kitchen is. But this guy, I have him in such a large container because sometimes I make more than one loaf of bread at a time, and it makes it easier to have a large bulk of starter on hand, so I don't have to worry about having enough starter to make whatever pops into my brain. So I have approximately 1 cup of starter here. I'm going to give you guys an easy way to remember how to feed your starter. If you look online, you'll find all sorts of confusing things, and it feels so hard to try to figure out how in the world to feed a starter, how to make sure it's correct. There's a ton of science behind this. I'm going to kind of skirt all the sciencey stuff today. If you're interested in that kind of thing, go look it up and read your heart out. It's really interesting. But I'm just going to try to make it as simple as possible, because when you're adding sourdough into your everyday life, some days we just need it to be super simple. The way I feed him is a 1:1:1 ratio. Simple, straightforward. 1 part starter to 1 part water to 1 part flour of your choice. This guy here is a completely whole wheat starter. Some people use unbleached all-purpose flour, some people use spelt, some people use rye. Everybody's got their reasons why they do what they do. I like the whole wheat just because I like to bake with a lot of whole wheat, and so it makes me happy, therefore I do it. But again, there's nothing wrong with doing an unbleached all-purpose flour starter. But this guy I feed with whole wheat. Again, the ratio is 1:1:1 whole wheat. So let's add in, I've got my whole wheat flour here. A really good way to measure this is actually using weight, but I don't have a scale nearby, so I just use volume measurements, which a lot of professional bread bakers would probably balk at, but I have gotten good, consistent results with volume. basing it more off of what the starter looks like and feels like as opposed to an exact weight. You don't really have to worry too much about messing up a mature starter as long as you feed it regularly, because they're a lot more hardy than people make them out to be. I built him, so I started this guy on my own, but if you're interested in getting a hold of a starter of your own, there's a couple of different options. You can purchase a starter in liquid form, or find it from a friend. If you know a friend who does starter dough or has a starter, they probably would share it with you without anything but excitement. You can also purchase it in a dried form. I actually dried some of Bruce here just in case something happens to him and he dies for some reason. That way I have some on hand. Online you can buy dried sourdough starter, and they will send it instructions with it on how to rehydrate it and get it ready to use. So I am stirring this guy here. You want to stir it vigorously with either wood, or I use silicone spatulas. There's some debate with that, but the biggest rule with sourdough starters is keep them in a glass environment and don't use metal for him. There's something funky that can happen when you use metal. It's just a more reactive material to the natural yeast biome you have going on. So it's just better not to mess with them. So I'm stirring it really good, getting all the little chunkies out. What I have done here with the 1-to-1 ratio is called 100% hydration starter. This is about the texture of pancake syrup, or not pancake syrup, excuse me, pancake batter. You will see some recipes, they'll say use 100% hydration starter, use a 60% hydration starter, and it can be pretty confusing if you're just diving off into sourdough land. The hydration level is basically the portion of water to flour that you add to your starter when you feed him. If it's got a lower percentage hydration, like 60%, it means that they use less water to flour ratio. It's good to have different hydrations for what you're doing, but it's not always necessary. There is nothing wrong with 100% hydration starter. I have bounced back and forth between doing a thicker 60% hydration and 100%, and honestly it just seems to be preference. I think that the higher hydration tends to build a fluffier loaf more frequently, but as with all bread products, your environment, your humidity, your warmth of your kitchen, those all play into how your bread turns out. So I'd say start at 100% because it's an easy ratio of 1 to 1 to 1, and then go from there. Don't be afraid to play with your starter and see what happens. Again, as long as you feed them regularly. Oh, you guys need to know how often to feed them. I feed my starter once every 24 hours. This is for a mature starter. But when my kitchen is really hot, I see that my starter gets hungry more frequently. So when he gets hungry, I feed him every 12 hours. This isn't an exact science. So if you go 13 hours or you feed him at 10 hours, you're not going to kill your starter. Your starter will be okay. They are hardy little beasties. But I'd shoot for 12 to 24 hours for feeding them, just to keep them healthy. There's another aspect of starters that's kind of important to address, and it's called hooch. The hooch is like this liquid that forms on the top of a sourdough starter when it's hungry. This is often the way you can tell that it's hungry, is by the hooch forming on the top. You don't want hooch to form on your starter a ton. Because it means you're leaving him really hungry a lot, and that can over time slowly break down the strength of your sourdough. It probably means that maybe your kitchen was a little hotter and he burned through his food a little bit more. I would just at that point be a little more careful to say, hey, you know what, for a little while I'm going to feed him every 12 hours till he gets good and strong again, just to preserve the healthy balance of bacteria in your starter. But hooch can be multiple different colors, and it can kind of freak you out the first time you see it. When it first starts forming, it'll be clear, but if it sits hungrier and hungrier and hungrier, it'll slowly darken in color, and it can be like a deep gray. There's some people that go, ah, and they scrape off all the hooch off the top and throw it away. That's fine, but you don't actually have to do that. You can stir it right in, feed your starter, and it's set. The only thing to be aware of with sourdough starter is that you don't want bad bacteria to take over your starter. So if your sourdough starter starts getting orange, or if you start seeing any mold on it, you need to throw away your starter and begin again. This is to keep a good, healthy balance of good bacteria and not let bad bacteria overtake your starter. All right, now that we have a fed sourdough starter, you can see it doesn't have any bubbles or anything in it yet, but as it sits over time, it will slowly gain bubbles. So what I do, because my jar has no marks on it like a measuring cup would have, I just stick a rubber band around it. This helps give me a visual as to how much my sourdough starter is growing and when is the best time for it to be used to bake. So I will probably use it when this has doubled in size. And as it doubles, it'll start forming little bubbles all over. That is the byproduct of the yeasty beasties eating up the sugars and carbohydrates in our starter. And we will watch it grow. A couple little notes about sourdough starter. It might seem overwhelming, the thought of feeding it once every 12 hours or once every 24 hours. For those of you that have a busier lifestyle than that, or only want to bake about once a week, there is another option that's perfectly good for your sourdough starter, and you can still maintain a healthy biome for your starter without all the upkeep. The option is refrigeration. There's some people that choose to freeze their starters too. This I have not done. I cannot speak to how well it works, but I'm sure there's other resources out there if that's something you need where you're traveling for a long amount of time and want to try to keep your starter alive. But I only know of the refrigeration, so that's what I'll share. When you put it in your refrigerator, you're fine. You want to feed it like it is here, and then you can just pop it right in the refrigerator. This will slow down the fermentation time. It makes your yeasty beasties eat through all of its food a lot slower, hence the reason you don't have to feed it as frequently. It won't be as hungry. When you're ready to use your sourdough starter, it takes a little bit of planning. You want to pull it out, I would actually say 2 days before you want to start baking. The reason for this is it takes time for your sourdough starter to warm up and reinvigorate and get good and bubbly and strong again, because it's super sleepy when it comes out of the refrigerator. So once you pull it out of the refrigerator, you discard half, feed with your 1:1:1 ratio. So if you're discarding half, but you have like a cup and a half, then feed it a cup and a half of flour and a cup and a half of water and start really good. Whatever ratio you want there. And then set it on the counter. Feed your starter every 12 hours until you're ready to bake. Once it starts completely doubling in size again and gets really good and bubbly along the sides, and when you open it and look at it, it's really good and bubbly along the top, you know that it's ready to use. There's another test you can also use to just double check and make sure your starter is strong enough to handle leavening a loaf of bread, and that's called the float test. It's not something that I do every single time I bake, but that is because I'm used to what my sourdough starter looks like and feels like when it's ready to be baked. The float test, all you do is you take a little dish or a little cup of cold water and you just take a little scoop out and place it in your water. If it floats to the top of the water, that means it's ready to go. If it sinks to the bottom, you want to keep letting it rise further. It might be early on in your rising process. When your sourdough starter is rising, it takes a good amount of time. It takes between 4 and 8 hours after feeding your sourdough starter before it will be ready to bake. The reason the time is so variable with this is due to environment. If your kitchen is really cold, it'll take a really long time for it to rise. Or if it's really hot, it might be ready in 4 hours, and then will start to subside down and not be as strong by that 8-hour mark. Yesterday it was actually really hot here. It was 80 degrees in the house, and my starter, I actually missed the peak of it because it had rapidly rose in 4 hours. And then when I looked at it at about 6 hours, it was already going back down again. But again, it really depends on your environment, so tweak with it, play with it. It's okay, you won't kill it. I think that's the biggest thing to remember when working with sourdough, is that it's a learning process, and just be willing to play with it and learn and explore and slowly build up your experiential knowledge with it. It's a lot of fun to do. It is kind of time consuming, but sometimes good things take time, and it can be a really enjoyable thing if you're willing to take the time to do it. Once your sourdough starter is good and bubbly and ready to use, there are a plethora of recipes all over the interwebs that you can look for to use your sourdough starter, as well as a lot of recipes out there to use the discard of it, which is when you scoop it out, throw half away. That throwing half away doesn't have to happen. There are recipes for using that as well. I hope you guys enjoyed watching, and I'll see you next time.